What's up, gang? Thanks for listening to the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm your host, Van Jackson. My guest today, I'm a big fan. In addition to being a professor of history at Georgetown University, he's an emeritus co-editor of Dissent magazine. Dissent, I don't know if you can see this t-shirt. He was once a member of SDS, Students for a Democratic Society. He's won an armful of awards and fellowships over the years. And he's written a bunch of books, good books, on American labor history, the progressive movement, the peace movement, and for my money, the seminal book on American populism called The Populist Persuasion. Incidentally, we're probably not going to talk about that book today, but it kind of anticipated somebody like Trump coming into the presidency, like way before it actually happened. My guest's latest book is called What It Took to Win, A History of the Democratic Party. And on top of all of this, he's got this new essay in Dissent called Reject the Left-Right Alliance Against Ukraine, which kind of prompted this episode. My guest is the legendary Michael Kazin. Dude, it's such an honor. Thanks for coming on the show. How are you?
Great. It's great to be here, Van. Thank you for asking me.
Yeah. So this show's audience skews quite young, and a lot of listeners and viewers would have had only a very thin understanding of the historical New Left that started forming, I guess, in the late 1950s. You've lived part of that era. You've written about it as part of What It Took to Win, the book, right? You know it better than most. It would be really valuable if you could kind of prime this whole conversation with your version of, how the New Left came to be and how it's differed from the old left or the labor left.
Sure. Well, one book I wrote you didn't mention, which is fine, is called American Dreamers: How the Left Changed Our Nation, which is of course, I write. That's the one time that I do some Democratic Party book too. But historians aren't supposed to really write about themselves. It's supposed to be the past, but I do. In the chapter on the 60s and the New Left in that book, talk a little bit about my own involvement. So the New Left was called New rather than just Next because it was its primary issues were not labor, were not class, which was the primary issue, the primary problematic for the old left. Mm-hmm. Primary issues were racial inequality and American imperialism, in specific the war in Vietnam, though there are other aspects of American imperialism that were very important to us as well. And also what was also new about it was the older lefts had been not entirely made up of working class people, small business people, earlier small farmers, but primarily they had been. Whereas the new left was most active on campuses at first, at least. And of course, the black left allied with there were college students, high school students aligned with ordinary people, sharecroppers, tenant farmers, factory workers, and others. But the New Left was the most prominent part of the New Left were students, were young people, sometimes had dropped out of college and hanging out in college towns like Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Berkeley, famously California. But it was really a young left and also a left that for whom class was an issue, but it was an issue as reflected through anti-imperialism and racial politics.
Man, that's a great start. So, SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, it figures prominently in every history of the New Left I've seen. You were a member. From what I've gleaned about you, you have this fascinating background. How did you end up part of the New Left and specifically SDS?
Well, I came from a liberal Jewish background. My father and mother were both sympathetic to the old left, though they were never members of the Communist Party or the Socialist Party. My mother, on spring vacation in college in 1936, went to Moscow.
Oh, wow.
Which was not the usual spring break at the time. She was 19. She went with a couple of friends. But obviously had enough money to go too. The other thing, my father was one of the so-called New York intellectuals named Alfred Kazin. He was a important literary critic, But he was very much became a Cold War liberal after being somewhat sympathetic to the left in the 1930s. Anyway, with that background, a lot of people with that background moved farther left, broke with our parents' politics, which was very much New Deal, liberal politics, and supportive of the Cold War, but not gung-ho supportive of it, but thinking there was no alternative but to side with the United States against the Soviet Union and its allies. And what was important to me, first of all, was the Black Freedom Movement. I wanted to go to Selma in 1965, but my mother said, too dangerous, you can't go. And I was a good boy. I didn't want to go anywhere. My mother didn't want me to go until later on, of course. And then the War of Vietnam really was what sort of broke my liberal heart, if you will, converted me from being a liberal Democrat to being a radical. And I went to every demonstration, every anti-war demonstration I could go to. I lived in a suburb of New York City, and that meant I could just go to Washington or go across the river to New York. I went to teach-ins, and then gradually, when I went to college, I started college in 1966 at Harvard. I gradually dropped my liberal democratic affiliations and joined SDS and was involved in taking over a campus building to protest ROTC chapter on campus and to try to set up a Black Studies department. And then for luckily short time, I joined Weatherman, which was, as some of your viewers, listeners know, a sort of would-be, white terrorist group.
Yeah, that's pretty radical.
Which, luckily, I left without, breaking the law and without going underground. I left actually to go to Cuba on a group called the Venceremos Brigade, which was American radicals breaking the blockade, helping the Cubans on this historic sugar harvest, 1969, 1970, which ended up being a disaster. But that's a different matter. So anyway, that's a very short.
Oh my God!
Profile of me. My time as a would-be revolutionary.
Geez, that's more radical than I had understood. Were you going to school this whole time? You became an academic and a prominent one.
I started college in '66, and then I dropped out to join Weatherman in '69. And then I went back. After I got out of the draft, I went back in '72 and finished. I had one more semester to go, so I finally graduated a couple of years late.
So were you done with like SDS and the Weathermen and everything, and then you go into a PhD? It just seems like balancing like radical activism and the kind of sit your ass in the chair and write. Like those things are hard to mesh together.
Yeah, well, again, I don't know how much you want to talk about the '60s, but really, the period between 1969 and 1973, when I started grad school, was a period when the New Left pretty much fractures, and some of the fragments which come out of it become very strong. The radical feminist movement, LGBTQ movement, that wasn't called that at the time, environmental movement. My old friend who unfortunately passed away last year, Todd Gitlin, famous New Leftist, said, so the New Left fragmented, but the fragments were doing pretty well. And I think in the '70s, that's certainly true. But there's no longer, and of course the U.S. under Nixon begins to pull American troops out of Vietnam, and of course increase the bombing and increase support to the South Vietnamese government. But really, by the early 1970s, there's no longer a united New Left, and the Black movement was fragmenting in many ways as well. So I figured I'd do something to make a living. So I'd always liked to study history. And so I was in Portland, Oregon at the time, editing a left-wing newspaper. And I decided to try graduate school and ended up, I liked it. And I'd always liked studying history and writing about history when I was a student. So here we are 50 years later.
That's fascinating. You've got this. This conversation is like intended to be actually quite wide ranging, and so this is a good setup. So your book, the new one, "What It Took to Win," it's this history of the Democratic Party. There's a sociologist, Stephanie Mudge, a few others who have written about how the Democrats only became the party of labor basically in the 1930s. And if that's the case, then what is the through line that you see connecting pre-30s and post-30s? Or do you even agree with that characterization? I mean,
well, yes and no. It's only in the 30s that labor becomes an important part of the Democratic Party and becomes essential, I think, to democratic victories in industrial states, especially. And as we know, the decline of the labor movement has both made it easier for neoliberal ideas to be powerful in the Democratic Party, and also for Democrats to lose support from a lot of working class people, especially white working class people, who, when unions were strong, used to vote for Democrats for the most part. Anyway, but I argue in the book that even though the labor movement was not connected closely to the Democratic Party until the 1930s, there was, I think, a strand which even reaches from Andrew Jackson in the 1820s and 30s, which was really the first time there was a mass Democratic Party. About 200 years ago, it gets formed. Jackson is famously a populist with a small p, and appeals to the interests of ordinary white workers and obviously ordinary white small farmers in many parts of the country, as well as slaveholders, in the South, of which he was one. But he runs against the money power, the second bank of the United States. And Democrats in general are big supporters of immigrants, especially Irish and German immigrants who are coming from very poor backgrounds, of course, to the United States back there in the 1840s and 50s. So there was a kind of a through line from that sort of populist support for working people, white working people. Let me underline that again.
Yeah.
Very, very specifically to the kind of rhetoric and then finally policies that Democrats do follow in the 1930s. But even there, American Federation of Labor, which was the major labor federation in the end of the 19th century, first 25, 30 decades of the 20th century, did back Democrats more than it did Republicans. In 1908, for the first time, the FFL supports a Democrat for president, William Jennings Bryan, I also wrote a biography about. And from then on, really from 1908 to 1920, they always support Democrats for president. And the Democrats under Wilson set up a Department of Labor as a cabinet office for the first time. They passed the 8-hour day for railroad workers, the first 8-hour day for private sector workers in American history. So, for all we can say, and it's certainly right, that the Democratic Party was a white supremacist party. When it came to white workers, Democrats tended to be supportive, sometimes rhetorically, sometimes with actual policies. So, I think that's the through line. I call it moral capitalism in the book, not because I agree capitalism in itself is moral, but I think Democrats have rhetorically and sometimes in policy throughout their history, very often, not always, but very often try to set forth, a program, a message, if you will, that does say capitalism, in theory, is a good system, but it needs to be one that can help, ordinary people more to become more of a moral system, which is a term I borrow from my friend Liz Cohen, who's a wonderful biographer, a wonderful historian of 20th century politics and labor. She wrote a great book called Making a New Deal, where she used the term moral capitalism to say what most workers wanted in the 30s was not obviously socialism. It was a different kind of capitalism, a capitalism that really would be on their side as much as that's possible.
So a sensibility that tries to get a better deal for folks, but largely within capitalism or affirming it. Yeah.
I mean, you can call it an American version of social democracy. It's a very weak social democracy compared to New Zealand, perhaps, or Scandinavia, but nevertheless, it has a social democratic tinge, you might say.
Okay. In the book, you do a good job of not having a socialist blind spot, which makes sense given your the way you see over all of this. And you mentioned the upswell of Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, since 2016, 2018.
Which I'm a member, so
yeah. And there's polls that show that of, I'm sure, or actually I think you mentioned it in the book, that show socialism is fairly popular among Gen Z in ways that it just wasn't when I was growing up in the unipolar moment or whatever. What do you think about DSA and the Working Families Party in relation to Democrats? My sense from the book is you don't want a third party split per se, but they should be allies. I mean, tell me what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think since I think the leftward, the growth of the left within the Democratic Party, I think really begins in many ways with the Great Recession. 2008, 2009. I mean, a lot of people on the left I know thought Obama was going to be, the way Bernie Sanders became. Of course, but he wasn't. But that was an illusion. But nevertheless, there was tremendous enthusiasm on the left for him. I mean, every leftist I knew, supported Obama, which was the first time since the 1930s that the left has supported a Democrat, like uniformly, pretty much. Not some Trotskyists didn't, but generally, there was a huge support for him. And out of that, partly DSA didn't grow at first, but I think the idea, especially among young people, not just young people, that a lot more was possible. But the Democratic Party could be transformed. You could enter the Democratic Party or increase your activism in the Democratic Party if you're already in it, and maybe make some gains. And that progressive caucus in the House begins to grow, and some more left-leaning people in labor, get close to the party, like Bill Fletcher, who's a longtime socialist in the labor movement. And then, of course, Bernie's campaign sort of reveals this trend, I think, in 2016. The very fact that he runs as a Democrat, even though he doesn't join the party, but he runs as a Democrat, as you know, is huge. It's probably the most important thing that the electoral left has done since, I don't know, Eugene Debs' last campaign. I don't know. But that's really so important because that, of course, makes it puts the word socialism out there, because people say, well, if Bernie Sanders is a socialist, he makes sense. Then maybe it's not such a bad thing after all. And of course, as you know, Bernie Sanders called himself a socialist, but he's really a social democrat.
Yeah,
I mean, he's given a couple speeches at Georgetown University, where I teach, about what does socialism mean to me, and each time he mentions Franklin Roosevelt, the Great Society, Martin Luther King Jr., if what they was doing or attacked the socialism, then that's great. That's what socialism should mean. So he's a moral capitalist in that sense. I mean, he's not calling for, doing for the state taking over the means of production. He's calling for a welfare state and more corporate regulation and higher taxes on the rich. Sort of things historically that the Social Democrats have done in this country. And I think most people in DSA, if you scratch them, really that's all they really expect to happen. So that's a long answer to your question, but I think that DSA has served a really good role of getting people involved in politics, and talking about what socialism means. But I think the fact that there are more and more DSA members and those sympathetic to it who are running for elections, sometimes winning, of course, in very blue states and very blue areas, but they're running as Democrats. And I think a third party, I can talk forever about the hazards of third parties. I think third parties can be useful when the two major parties are just not listening to, what, quote, the people want and need. I think Democrats, have moved farther to the left than any time, arguably since 1972, George McGovern's campaign, and there is space for progressives to have influence in the Democratic Party. They already do have influence in the Democratic Party, so I think that's all to the good.
Yeah, I didn't plan to ask you this, but the way you were characterizing Bernie and the way that a lot of like DSA people talk about Bernie, which I think imputes a lot that's not there necessarily. How do you think about Elizabeth Warren in relation to Bernie? Like, I to be on the cards on the table, like I worked for Warren's campaign in 2020, but I was also a Bernie guy. Like and like I'm part of his larger network even right now. So like I don't see these two as adversarial at all.
No.
I thought they were on a pretty similar wavelength, but in 2020, they're I don't know, their clients or whatever were at each other's throats. What do you think of them?
Well, of course, they're politicians. They both wanted to win, right? That's how the game is played, right?
Yeah.
So, we love each other. And by the way, vote for me, not the other guy, or the gal, Well, I think during the 2020 campaign, she said, "I'm a capitalist," which is weird because, she's not actually, does not own a business, as far as I know. But Biden says the same thing. It's a strange use of words, but anyway, she said the market system, can work pretty well if we make it work really well. I think. So in that sense, I think her differences with Bernie are very small ones. I think I supported her not because I liked her politics more, but I thought that someone who called himself a socialist could not be elected president in the United States without a much larger socialist movement. So I was just being practical about it. But if I thought he could have won, I would have supported him probably. But I don't think they differ that much. I mean, I'm sure there's some issue in which they've disagreed, but I don't know what it is.
It's pretty, kind of stylized. Okay. I wanted to get your thoughts on foreign policy overall, but then the trigger for this episode was really that Dissent piece you had called Reject the Left-Right Alliance Against Ukraine. I think I told you when we were setting this up, like I was just kind of head nodding as I was reading through it, and that's usually a good sign. Can you give an overview of your argument in that piece, and then maybe what drove you to write it?
Well, I decided to write it because I was alarmed that people I knew on the left, some at DSA, but mostly other folks I follow on social media for no good reason, were basically saying things sounded a lot like things that Tucker Carlson was saying or Donald Trump was saying. that we have no business there. It was NATO's fault. NATO shouldn't have expanded. They weren't actually saying, "Oh, rah rah rah," Vladimir Putin, but they were saying that this is all the U.S.'s fault, basically. That Putin sort of had no choice. He was encircled and so forth. And I thought that was, not to put too fine a point on it, immoral. Because to me, whatever you think of the larger context, and we can talk about that, and that matters, of course. What's happening there seems quite basic and simple. In the sense of who's fighting. An imperialist country, at least a formerly imperialist country, which would like to have its empire back, invaded a sovereign nation whose people do not want to be taken over by that imperialist country. I mean, that to me is the basic reality of what's going on there. And you can say other things about it, but you have to acknowledge that. And if you acknowledge that, then I think, and this is what's controversial on the left, then you have to say, well, maybe the United States should help Ukrainians win with military support, because if without that military support from the U.S. and its allies, the Ukrainians will lose. I mean, right now it's a stalemate, but that's just obvious, to everybody, right? Should be obvious to those who oppose U.S. military as well. Putin is not going to say, okay, NATO is staying out. I'll pull back. That's not going to happen. So that's why I wrote the piece. I wanted to to me, this is a little bit like the America First movement, 1940, 1941, which, if your listeners don't know, was a pretty large movement, which united some people on the left, like Norman Thomas, with people on the right, like Charles Lindbergh and Gerald Ford, when he was a college student at the University of Michigan, in saying this war that's going on in Europe is not something the U.S. should be part of. All those Europeans are always fighting with each other. We don't want to be part of that. And then Pearl Harbor happens, and guess maybe we're at war. So now the similarity there, of course, Putin is not Hitler. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that I think there are certain times when, if you're a leftist, you have to take a stand to support people who are being invaded, who did not ask to be invaded, and to support those who are supporting them. And we can talk about the difficulties. We can talk about what's going to happen to the war. We can talk about, American militarism and all that. But I think important to acknowledge, that basic fact about this war.
Yeah, there's an Occam's razor quality to this specific case. It's very straightforward.
The specifics matter. I think the specifics matter. I quote a Ukrainian democratic socialist who I just found on the internet, whose name is Alona Liasheva. And she basically says, look, let's analyze. Leftists should analyze what's happening, in every specific incident. We shouldn't act as, what's really going on here is a great power rivalry. well, yeah, that's going on too. But there are people involved here who have lives, those lives are being disrupted and they're being killed, and they're right to fight back.
Yeah, you can't just ignore the concrete. I mean, so a couple episodes ago, we sort of covered this whole Rage Against the War Machine protest, and that was in your piece. That was kind of like the news peg that was
Right.
indexed against. So that protest's been going on for a few years, and it attracts this year especially this like very motley crew, kind of America firsty in a sense, like you were saying, because there are some pacifist and anti-war activists there, but there were like actual named neo-fascists there. There were a bunch of libertarians. The politicians who showed up were all of like a very controversial variety. And then the weird thing about this, which I think you mentioned in the piece too, is that there were overt, explicit pro-Russia, pro-Putin flags and propagandists there, which I don't know that was the case in years past. I haven't followed it in years past, but like that is disconcerting, like how you're aligned with like, and then you describe in that context, you talk about like some Green Party people, Chris Hedges, as like literally embracing an alternate reality. They're not perceiving the basic situation as it is, where Putin has been this naked aggressor acting as an imperialist. What do you attribute this like lack of perceiving reality to?
A couple things. First, I think some people are really pacifists or think that military intervention is always wrong. I think Hedges on believing that. But there's also, I think, a sense coming out of the 1960s, actually, which that if U.S. power is used anywhere, it's always evil. It's always a mistake. U.S. power should never be used anywhere. Can never be used for good, because U.S. is imperialist power, and it's just oxymoron that imperial power, can be a good thing. And I think again, one has to look at specifics. I remember way back in the 90s, I was at some conference and I had a debate with Ramsey Clark, who many listeners probably don't know. He was a liberal Democrat. He was Attorney General for a while, and then the Johnson, but then he moved far to the left. And we were arguing about what it would have taken to stop the genocide in Rwanda, in the mid 1990s, which I hope your listeners know what happened there. Hundreds of thousands of people were wiped out by one ethnic group in Rwanda against another one. And I said, I think I would have been happy if Bill Clinton had sent in the Marines, to Rwanda. And Clark went apoplectic. He said, send in the Marines, just like Vietnam, just like the Dominican Republic. And I said, there was a genocide happening there, and if we could have stopped the genocide, I would have been happy to send in the Marines. And again, I think there's a sense on the left, and it's usually right, by the way, that U.S. power is usually not used in a good cause. But sometimes, for all kinds of reasons, it can be. And we should again look at the specifics there. That's not to say we shouldn't have a smaller military. It's not to say U.S. has been imperial power throughout its history, beginning, of course, with massacring Native Americans in the 17th century, before there was the United States. But at the same time, there are other powerful countries in the world, like Russia, like China, who have their own interests as well. And to assume that the United States should just stand around and do nothing while these countries do whatever they feel like doing is, I think, naive and unrealistic. Now we can argue, what should the U.S. do? And I'm sure you've done that with a lot of your guests. But to say the U.S. should always do nothing, there's always wrong for the U.S. to do anything about problems in the world, I think is first of all politically completely unrealistic, and secondly, at times, the wrong answer.
Yeah, I mean, this case too specifically, it seems like if you know about Putin as the face of a kind of transnational neo-fascism, right?
Mhm.
Whatever position you take on the war has to be connected to an argument about how to oppose this fucking guy, you
Yep.
know? Like, do you think some people on the left are just not aware that he's spent the past 10 years being this cultural beacon of the global far right? Like, do they not know that?
I think they are afraid of a new Cold War. They're afraid of,
It's understandable, yeah.
this rally around the flag kind of thing. Look, most people, your generation, and of course my generation, and older folks in general, remember 9/11. What happened after 9/11,
Mhm.
and of course the U.S. Americans were justified in being angry at Al Qaeda. But of course, what happened after that was, a war in Afghanistan, which didn't turn out very well, and a war in Iraq, which was, of course, begun on false pretenses, and didn't turn out quite as badly as the war in Afghanistan for U.S. interests, but turned out pretty badly as well. So I think that's this fear that we're going to again get a strengthened national security state, that we're going to get that the Cold Wars are bad things, which I agree they are. But the question is what you do about that situation. What we do about, for example, the emerging, well, not so emerging, the China-Russia alliance.
Mhm.
Is that something we should be concerned about as leftists? I think we should be concerned about it as people in the world. What do
Yeah.
we do about that? How do we get to détente? How do we get to peaceful coexistence? I think that's where we should get to, but because we're not going to overthrow Putin, and we shouldn't even try, of course. We're obviously not going to overthrow Xi, but we're faced with, we are in a new Cold War of sorts. In fact, right now we're kind of in a hot war by proxy in Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
So what do we do about that? I don't have all the answers by any means. I'm not a national security guy, a foreign policy person, really, but I think it's a question that people on the left should be asking themselves, and to say nothing. Just don't have a new Cold War. Just don't denounce China. Don't denounce Putin. That's not an answer.
Yeah, you have to have this. My language is like you have to have a theory of least harm in whatever
Uh-huh.
you're advocating. If you're going to be on the left, you have to. If you're a reactionary, maybe you don't care about least harm. But like that's if there's anything that glues us together, it's surely, you know, um, the far right.
Can I say one more thing about that? Michael Walzer, who was co-editor with me of Dissent, and great
Yeah.
political theorist, some people know. And he's to my right to a certain degree. He's called himself a liberal socialist, which is an interesting term. But he says we should all usually listen first to people on our side in these countries, and what they would like. Doesn't mean we have to go along with that, but
Mhm.
I like to ask people on the left who don't think we should be helping the Ukrainians, what about these democratic socialists in Ukraine?
Mhm.
I don't think any of them are saying don't do anything. What about those people in China and Hong Kong who are on the left, who and Taiwan, which is a pretty
Yeah.
social democratic country in many
Yeah.
ways, who don't want to be taken over by an authoritarian state, and Hong Kong they already have been. So I think important to look at who people like us are in these
Mhm.
countries. Doesn't mean we have to go along with what they would like us to do as Americans, but we should at least listen to them and know what they think.
Yeah, if you're engaged, like I'm obviously very critical of the U.S. national security state, but like if indulging in like reverse American exceptionalism kind of forecloses on being able to center others, like,
Mhm.
and that also should be something that we try to do. Um, the far right infiltration of the Rage Against the War Machine stuff, yeah, it's one small part of this larger pattern of these bizarro left right realignments that are happening on the margins of the left and the right. And, my sense generally has been that red brown alliances are just brown, like what's the joke? Like, what do you call 10 people sitting down to dinner with one Nazi? 11 Nazis,
I never
And
heard that.
that's my sort of general view, and I kind of extend it to the Ukraine issue. Like, I don't see the upside of making common cause with Tucker Carlson or, people who are against like political and economic democracy. And so I wanted to know, like, is your opposition to a sort of red brownism or left right alliance, is that a general position, or is it just like you're expressing that specifically about Ukraine?
Good question. I guess it would depend on the issue to an extent. For example, there's this magazine on the right now called Compact Magazine. I
Yes,
don't know if
that's what I had in mind.
edited by Sir Rob Armari, who was the New York Post op-ed editor, I think, for a while, and clearly was a pro-Trump person, at least for a while. But it's an interesting magazine. I mean, there are Marxists who write for it. There are. And it takes a very pro-union position, for example, and anti-corporate position, not just anti-woke corporations, but very suspicious of corporate power generally. Well, if people like that support unions, and I think having a more powerful labor movement is essential to having a more powerful left in this country, fine. In the end, if they vote Republican, Republicans are not going to want a more powerful labor movement. I'm sure of that. So they're going to lose. So I guess it depends on the issue. I don't really see, I mean, we're so polarized in terms of political parties in this country right now. I don't really see people like that in the end supporting Joe Biden against Ron DeSantis or against Donald Trump if he gets a nomination again, or any Republican for that matter. Because in the end, when it comes down to it, the issues they really care about are really more the cultural issues, quote, pro-family issues and abortion especially. So, but I think, if people on the right get more friendly to labor unions because they read a magazine like that or hear speeches like that, then by people like that, then that's fine with me. But it's not the same as having an alliance with them.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that I'm wary of is trading off, I guess, pitting political and economic democracy against each other. Like, that's my concern, right? Like
I agree.
sacrificing, LGBT rights or, like that kind of thing. Or abortion rights, like that would be problematic just so that we can get a higher minimum wage. Like that kind of trade-off is poisonous, I think.
I mean, we got to look to doing what, say, Democrats have just done in Michigan, which is pass protections for LGBT people and repeal the right to work law there. So, because I'm a progressive Democrat as well as a social Democrat, and to me the two aren't very different. And I want the Democrats, of course, to keep embracing the cultural issues that Democrats have for the most part embraced over the last 10 years, 20 years, and be much stronger, proponent of labor unions, of corporate regulation, and obviously environmental regulation as well. So, and people on the right are not going to go along with us on many of those issues. So
yeah. I mean, the thing is, like, even as I embrace a sort of social democratic core politically, I do not want to live in an illiberal society, and I imagine most people wouldn't, and so like,
right, exactly,
yeah.
And also, I mean, religion comes in here too. I mean, I'm not opposed to obviously people believing in things, and I wrote this kind of empathetic biography of William Jennings Bryan, who was a fundamentalist Protestant as well as a progressive politically. But at the same time, if you really, as a lot of, as you say, liberals on the right want to have a society which is more explicitly Christian, or at least where there's lots of carve-outs for believers, that's a real mistake, I think. One of the great things about American society is we don't have established religions, and we've pushed off people who wanted to have an established religion, whether by that name or some other name.
Yeah. I just finished writing a book about leftist foreign policy, so I've been marinating on this kind of line of reasoning for a while. So I have some sympathy. This is kind of going back to the Ukraine thing indirectly, but I have sympathy for the view of like a socialist who is committed to demilitarizing the national security state and opposes war on those grounds. If they're, willing to do something or make an argument about how to fight, fascism in Russia or Ukraine, like a lot of American communists in the 30s, as you know this better than I do, like they went over there to Spain personally to fight Franco. They didn't, for the most part, they were not lobbying the US government to invade Spain. But, the parts of the left that are against the Biden administration's Ukraine policy, they're not trying to support Ukraine by other means, and they're sure as hell not going over there themselves to fight, but also like, be the support we're providing Ukraine is not changing U.S. force structure. Like, if you provide no military support to Ukraine, you still have a military committed to primacy, right? Primacy is indexed against the China threat, not Russia. And so, like, primacy drives force structure. Force structure drives the size and shape of the defense budget. So doing nothing about Russia's invasion does not help you restrain the national security state. And like, I don't really know what to do with that, but I feel like there's something being missed analytically here in opposing doing anything in Russia or doing anything in Ukraine on the grounds that, like, you're trying to restrain the national security state. Like, there's an illogic to that, to me. I don't know.
No, I think you're right. I can't wait to read your book. By the way, Michael Walzer wrote a little book called A Foreign Policy for the Left, which you probably know.
I read it. Yeah.
But anyway, well, look, I think realistically, again, and one of the things that changed since I was a new leftist was I think first about what Michael Harrington called the left wing of the possible. So what's possible in terms of our military and national security state? I think no, probably just chipping around the edges of it is only possible as long as people perceive, and of course there's people politicians want us to keep perceiving that there are these threats, and what do you do about that perception? Well, I think you trying to find ways to minimize the perception of the threat by actually trying to minimize the threat by figuring out what kind of deal can we make with the Chinese? What kind of deal so they don't invade Taiwan? What kind of deal once this war is over, perhaps can we make with Russia? I don't know what those are, but obviously the military was decreased. The size was decreased to a degree after the Cold War ended. Not enough, obviously, but it was to a certain degree. And this is a huge structure, as you know much better than I do. And of course, it's not just doesn't just run on the fear Americans have about threats from abroad. Also, it's an economic structure, and it's a lot of people make their money, from it, and a lot of people. The military is a pretty good. If you don't have any good options, join the military is not a bad one. As long as you're not going to, get at risk of being killed.
Yeah.
And I've had students at Georgetown who are in the military who actually are leftists, but they are leftists in the military. And of course, there's only certain things they can say and do. But I've had students say, "Oh, it was terrible. It's stupid to invade Iraq. It was stupid to invade Afghanistan, even." But they don't have any answers either to this. What you do about it? So, look, I think this is probably the hardest thing for a leftist to deal with, this problem of what to do about the military, because, as I mentioned, you can say, as some people on the left do, including those I'm critical of for not supporting Ukraine, let's just talk about cut the military budget by half, cut it by 2/3. Keep saying that over and over and over again. Well, you can say that, but it's not going to get anywhere. I don't think. You're not anywhere very far unless there's a perception that we don't need this military. And that's what you've got to focus on.
To make that case, yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. What do you, in that context, the socialist DSA, when the International Committee, they produce some like weird points of view sometimes on foreign policy. And I think some of that is a pathology of like how they reach decisions, but do you, and I know, but then like DSA will issue some press release or something sometimes. Do you reject the line or have caveats or reservations about like the slogan "No war but class war"? Literally no war.
That's of course a line from like 100 years ago.
Yeah, they used it recently.
That's basically what Lenin said, right? I have to quote from Lenin, right, during World War I at the Zimmerwald meetings or something in 1915 or 16. I don't remember. Right? I should know this as a historian of the left, but exactly what the provenance of that line is.
It's just become a cliche, though.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I don't agree with it in terms of Ukraine.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of a war. Look, I write in my book on World War I, which I thought was a bad war. U.S. I think should not have entered it.
Oh yeah, I want to talk to you about that
the
in a minute,
only war that I support unreservedly in retrospect, which is an easy thing to do, support wars in retrospect, that the U.S. has fought. The Civil War on the Union side and World War II. I'm ambivalent about Korea in some ways, but because of what's happened since then, because South Korea is such a much more humane society and than North Korea. But that's after the war. So World War II, would people say no war but class war? Have said, oh, we shouldn't have been in World War II. I don't think so. And certainly the communists didn't say that. Once, of course, the Soviet Union was invaded in 1941. Before that, they were more ambivalent. So, I think, again, let's look at the specifics. Part of the problem with wars is that pretty much every country that goes to war says, oh, we're not aggressors. This is a defensive war.
Yeah.
And I write in my book, War Against War, that the Socialist International, Second International, had a conference in, I think it was Stuttgart in 1907. They debated whether socialists should ever support their country going to war. And they said, no, never, except for defensive wars. Well, lo and behold, 1914, when war breaks out, between the Serbs and the Austro-Hungarians originally, and then, of course, it blows up. Pretty much every socialist party in Europe, except for the Italians, supports their government in war because it's a defensive war, right? And the U.S. Socialist Party does not go along with that. But to their and we should, of course, that's one of the better things that's happened in the history of the American left, morally. But that's the problem, of course. Wars are usually, look, in 9/11, the invasion of Afghanistan was seen as a defensive war as well by most Americans because Al-Qaeda had attacked us from Afghanistan.
Yeah, self-defense is self-evidently right or justifiable, but then the question is, well, how do you know? Okay, so actually, I wanted to put the Ukraine stuff in historical context a bit. And the War Against War book that you had, fantastic book. I mean, it's one of those things like I dog-eared the shit out of it. I underlined it all. Like I read that thing deeply, and there's no way to read it and then come away thinking that like it was smart for the U.S. to enter World War I. And so like it was a tragedy, it was a mistake, right? So I wonder if you could reflect a little on World War I as you just started doing, because there's a Wilsonian reading of World War I that's quite common, right? There were conservatives who were opposed to the war, as you write in the book, but then anti-imperialists and socialists had their own reasoning. So, like why was the left opposed to World War I? Why were progressives split on the war?
Well, most socialists in this country, and of course anarchists, were opposed to going into the war because they thought it was an imperialist war. I mean, they agreed with Lenin on that. They thought
it was.
Yes. they thought, well, maybe the Germans were more aggressive. They did go into Belgium, of course, and do horrible things. But they couldn't support a war supporting the Tsarist Empire, which was, the Tsar was in power till just a couple months before the U.S. did declare war in 1917. Or the British Empire, or the French Empire, of course, on the other side. So that was their analysis, that this was, they thought, just a war between empires that the U.S. had no right to support, no reason to support. But there were people on the left, like John Dewey, like a minority of American socialists, who said, first of all, the Germans were the aggressors, and they want to set up a authoritarian Europe under their leadership, even though there was the majority of the Social Democratic Party in Germany did support the war and did until close to the end of the war. So it was not Hitler, certainly. It was a partially democratic country, was Imperial Germany. And also they thought, as a lot of socialists in Europe did, that, well, if the Socialist Party supports the war, maybe that will help embed socialism within the American government to a degree. That was happening in European countries at the time. And maybe Americans will say, well, these socialists, maybe they're not so terrible revolutionaries. Maybe they really want to go along with this great national effort. And this is the way women suffragists argue, for example. And maybe that'll get some gains for the Socialist Party. So there was a combination of supporting Wilson's reasons for going to war and opportunist reasons to think maybe the left would get something out of supporting the war. But the Socialist Party did not go along with it, and as your listeners probably know, Socialists suffered very badly from the war. Eugene Debs got a 10-year jail sentence for giving a speech, in 1918, arguing that the draft was something which should not, Americans shouldn't go along with it, and so newspapers were banned from the mails, and the Socialist Party never really recovered, and then it split in 1919 because a lot of people in the Socialist Party wanted to emulate the Bolsheviks and move towards a revolutionary attempt as soon as possible.
Yeah, there's a recurring theme on the show where we're highlighting the domestic sort of democratic price that we pay in the terrain of war, which is a difficult thing to reconcile with the fact that, like, I'm not a pacifist, we're not pacifists. There's like an anti-war sense, kind of like what you're saying, an anti-war sensibility, and that comes in part from understanding the real price that democracy pays when we do things like World War I. But then when you're faced with like straight up imperialism by someone else, like, you got to do something. We have the means to do something,
And as you mentioned about 1930s, the Lincoln Brigade, there were 4,000 communists or pro-communists. They weren't all members of the party who went to Spain to fight and for the Spanish Republic. But also the left was demanding at the time that Roosevelt, send arms to Spain, to Republican Spain. And of course, he wasn't going to do that because he was afraid of losing the Catholic Church. And the British and French lefts were demanding the same thing. George Orwell famously went to Spain, and he was a democratic socialist, and he and what a great book about it, Homage to Catalonia, everyone should read. But they didn't succeed in doing that either. And if they had, who knows whether the Spanish Republic might have survived.
Yeah, that's a good point. Clearly, you see important differences between Russia's war now and World War I. What, especially from a social democratic perspective or whatever. What do you see different there? Every war is different, but like, what is the difference between World War I, where we shouldn't have gotten involved, and Ukraine, where we should?
Well, I think Ukraine, as I said before, is a key example of a large, powerful country invading a smaller, less powerful one against the wishes of those people. And World War I, certainly Germany invading Belgium was terrible. The rationale was they wanted to get to France before the Russians invaded them. There's a thing called the what was it called? The Schlieffen Plan, which was invade the France first before the Russians invade us from the east. Anyway, we can do World War I all day, I'm sure. But I think the Russians got involved in the war to support the Serbs, and the Serbs were an expansionist country. That's why a Serbian terrorist killed, the Archduke and Archduchess of Austria-Hungary. So in other words, there were no good guys. There were some guys who were a little bad, a little worse than other guys. And I don't know what would have happened if the Germans had won World War I. That's a counterfactual we can talk about. But post what's happening now, it seems, this seems again like a clear case, I think, of imperial aggression. And there it was more complicated. Putin has made no bones about the fact he wants to recreate the Soviet Empire, which of course before that was a Tsarist empire. He's not going to invade Kazakhstan, certainly, but Ukraine, of course, the history, as you know, is been much more important to Russia than say Kazakhstan was, and it's more important economically. So many Ukrainians do speak Russian, some as their first language, but so many Belgians speak French too. Doesn't mean they'd be happy if France invaded Belgium.
Yeah, no, I mean World War I it was empires against empires, and there's a way in which it's like a plague on all of your houses, even though it's like really tragic. But There's
and also, of course,
one big imperialist right now.
There was a possibility, and we talked about Lenin before. I'm no Leninist, but the idea that there were factions of the socialist parties in Europe as well that opposed going to war. The SPD in Germany split over that and set up an independent socialist party, which people like Kautsky and Bernstein supported. And Rosa Luxemburg, of course, helps to form the German Communist Party. And I don't see that now. I don't see there being this sort of group on the left, which has a really good solution to the war in Ukraine, other than just U.S. should stay out. Which is not a solution for the Ukrainians. Whereas opposing World War I would have been a good solution at the time. You would have stopped the killing. You're not going to stop the killing here unless one side wins.
Yeah, I mean, there was an argument then.
Eventually, there'll be a negotiated settlement, probably. But
yeah. There's no in the advocacy now. There's not a clear path forward. That's the alternative.
Exactly.
It's just like you say the word diplomacy or something, but it's like, what's the theory of diplomacy? Like how? Yep. Interesting. Okay, what are your thoughts about NATO? It's complicated, and there are I know socialists in Europe who live in NATO member countries who are basically opposed to NATO as a long-term proposition, but you go to war with the army you've got, and there's an immediate issue, and NATO's available, so it's like they have no problem with NATO support for Ukraine. Again, it's like a complicated thing. How do you think about?
NATO? Again, counterfactual. Would have been great if in 1991, George H.W. Bush, went to Gorbachev, and then I guess it was Yeltsin, and said, let's make a deal for all time. Let's make a treaty that we'll do away with NATO if you cut back your military and we do away with nuclear weapons and, a wonderful, great, real coexistence, But, that didn't happen.
Yeah.
And these countries that had been, part of the Soviet Empire, and I think it's fair to call it that, a lot of them wanted to join NATO because they knew there was a possibility that they'd be under stress, at least from the Russians again. So do countries have the right to make their own foreign policy? Sovereign countries? Yeah, I think they do. Now, did the U.S. want them to join NATO? Yeah, that's true as well, right? So what do we do in 2022 when the invasion happens, right? At that point, I think you're right. I hate to quote Donald Rumsfeld, as you did before, but if you think the Ukrainians have a right to control their own territory and push back the Russians, then NATO makes sense. In the long run, of course, I don't think NATO is a good idea. But then I'm a peacenik, but it's the left wing of the possible. Again, right now, to say NATO should be disbanded is to say exactly what Putin would like to happen. And of course, not just that, but it's like saying we should do away with capitalism right away in the United States. That's not a politics which is going to get you anywhere. So. Unless you're on the right, or some people you mentioned, like some people at that rally, so anti-war machine rally. So I think again, it's a long way of saying I don't know. In the perfect world, of course, we should have no NATO. And after this is over, and if there's some way to roll it back, of course I'm for it. I don't think NATO should be a permanent fixture in Europe. I don't think there should be military alliances at all. But the question, as always, is what the hell we do about them, how we get rid of them. And I'd like to hear from people on the left who have something to say besides don't support NATO. That's a slogan. It's not a politics.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. You have to kind of deal with the world as it is. Man, okay. We really blew a moment at the end of the Cold War in hindsight where we the U.S. and the Bush administration for sure at that point was not in a headspace, or they had no horizon of the possible where they could have transcended systems of mutual fear and deterrence, and this
Oh,
like
right.
this precarious way of security that we think about, especially in national security. They couldn't envision that, but I feel like the rest of the world was like uniquely amenable in
Mhm.
that moment, and we, in that sense, we kind of fucking blew it.
Yeah, look, I mean, you can't take a Cold War and all of a sudden decide change their minds 100%.
Yeah, yeah.
So or even 50%. I mean, George H.W. Bush was director of the CIA.
Yeah.
Remember, so
Contemporary sort of democratic foreign policy. I have concerns about how hawkish Democrats have become. I spent years in as like a insider cadre, like the national security policy arm of the Democratic Party, and some of my friends are still there. I've become very alienated from that world because I'm a critic of primacy, and a liberal primacy is taken for granted among DC Democrats because, I mean, 90% of the foreign policy apparatus is like Atari Democrats and closet Republicans and former neocons. And that's a very different cadre from like the domestic policy stuff. So, and what's funny is like Ukraine is one of the bright spots that I see in Biden's foreign policy. But in the main, I have concerns about the overall project, overall direction of things.
oh, I do too. I do too. And I mean, look,
That was
yeah.
what's your thoughts overall?
Again, you got more answers than I do, I think, Van, about this because you've been inside there and you know these people. I'm just a left wing historian out here trying to make sense of what I read about.
You're
Um,
more than that, dude.
so it's again, as I said before, I mean, I think you give me a way to talk about Russia and China right now, and climate change too, of course.
Mhm.
And I would I think, of course, you want to have a small national security state, and people on the left, people and liberals, and whether in the Democratic Party or outside it, who think that this is just a permanent thing, who don't have any strategy for getting out of it. I mean, one of the people I like a lot is Matt Duss. Matt stuff. He used to
Yes,
be
he's a friend.
Bernie Sanders' foreign policy guy, and
Yeah.
I trust his instincts about these things. And of course, we haven't even talked about the Middle East, which is a different
Yeah, that's a
situation.
really bad.
But I think one question for historians is, and for all of us, is whether the U.S. is in fact a declining empire. And declining empires can decline gracefully, as say the Dutch did, but then they didn't have a massive $2 trillion a year defense establishment. Or they can decline in a pretty rough way, the way in some ways the Soviets did, and the French did. Look at Algeria and so forth. So it can be very bloody. So I think in some ways maybe it's a task of the left to try to figure out a politics of how to talk to Americans about the fact we're a declining empire, that we are an empire, and how to make sure that transition to being a non-imperial country can happen, without a lot of bloodshed. Again, if I had an answer to that, I'd be writing about it. I don't have an answer to that, but I think that maybe is the task of the left, and within the Democratic Party as well as outside the Democratic Party. I mean, there are people in the Progressive Caucus. Sanders himself has talked about this in different ways as well. I think people should keep doing it, but of course, Sanders, as you know, is completely supportive of our support for Ukraine right now. At least I haven't heard him be critical of it, and so that I think is probably his way of balancing those two, the short term politics about Ukraine and the longer term politics is probably a good one.
Yes, it's an extremely good point that our task on some level has to be like thinking about, or how we manage, or how we talk about even a kind of relative decline or imperial decline. And you got to do that without invoking, things like malaise or leaning too heavily on stuff like that alienates people. And one of the things I was hoping is that, like Bernie specifically with Matt, we've developed this conception of like a progressive global order,
Mm-hmm.
and redirecting some of that energy toward like shoring up democracy at home as abroad, not at abroad in lieu of at home, which is kind of the bargain we've had for a while. And like, maybe I was thinking that maybe like a progressive global order, that kind of vision, is a way of like managing decline, but in a way that is like a productive force,
I think as a vision, I'm all with it. But of course,
Yeah.
we need allies. We need allies in other countries to support that. And as you know, democracy ain't doing so well in the world at the moment.
Yes. Thanks so much. Guest again, Michael Kazin, the newest book, What It Took to Win, A History of the Democratic Party. Thanks for coming on the show. This was awesome.
Thanks. It was a great conversation, and I look forward to reading your book.
Yeah, thank you. All right, take care.